The American Civil War was one of the darkest and most brutal chapters in the history of the United States, not only because of the bloodshed on the battlefield, but also because of what happened away from it inside prison camps behind closed doors and within the shadows of punishment and humiliation. While most people know about the staggering death toll of the war, what often goes untold are the barbaric and deeply humiliating punishments inflicted upon Confederate prisoners of war. These punishments weren't always about physical pain alone, they were about breaking the will of men, destroying their dignity, and leaving scars that went far beyond the body. Among the most shocking of these punishments was one that stands out for its cruelty and sheer degradation: tying prisoners face first to the rear of cattle for hours. To understand why such a punishment would be used, we need to look at the context of the Civil War itself. Between 1861 and 1865, the Union and the Confederacy were locked in a brutal struggle not only for territory, but also for the very identity of the nation. In this climate, hatred ran deep, and treatment of prisoners often reflected the raw bitterness between the two sides. Prison camps were notorious for their inhumane conditions. Union soldiers held in Confederate prisons like Andersonville faced starvation and disease, while Confederate prisoners in Union facilities experienced equally harsh conditions. But beyond neglect and poor living standards, there was another layer to the cruelty: deliberate psychological punishment meant to degrade and break prisoners on a personal level. The act of tying Confederate prisoners to cattle was more than just a physical restraint. It was an intentional method of humiliation, turning soldiers who once carried themselves with pride into figures of ridicule. Imagine the scene: a Confederate prisoner, stripped of dignity, bound tightly so that his face pressed against the hindquarters of a cow or an ox. The animal would be led around or left to wander, forcing the prisoner into an excruciating position. The physical discomfort was intense: rough hides scratching against skin, the stench unbearable, muscles cramping as the hours dragged on. But beyond this was the mental toll. Soldiers, men who once fought with honor, were reduced to a spectacle, treated worse than animals, forced into a position that mocked their humanity. This punishment was not only about suffering, it was symbolic. By tying Confederate prisoners to livestock, Union guards sent a clear message: you are beneath us. You are no better than beasts, and your rebellion has reduced you to nothing more than a subject of mockery. It was a way to strip prisoners of pride, a weapon aimed directly at morale. And in a war where identity and cause meant everything, this was a devastating blow. What made this punishment so psychologically scarring was the fact that it attacked the very core of a soldier's sense of self. Soldiers thrived on honor, on courage, on the idea that even if captured, they remained men of value. But when tied to the rear of cattle, honor was erased. Those forced into this punishment were not only physically uncomfortable, but also left with a deep sense of shame. Prisoners often endured ridicule from guards and even from civilians who witnessed such acts. Laughter, jeering, and insults rained down on them, reinforcing their humiliation. Hours in that position could feel like an eternity, bound face first against the animal, breathing in dust and filth, unable to move or resist. Prisoners were left with nothing but the crushing weight of humiliation. The punishment was not designed to kill, but it left scars far deeper than most physical wounds. Many Confederate prisoners who endured it never forgot the experience, and some carried that humiliation with them for the rest of their lives. It's important to remember that these punishments didn't happen in isolation. The Civil War prison system itself was a nightmare. Tens of thousands of soldiers died not on the battlefield, but in prison camps. Disease, malnutrition, overcrowding, and exposure were rampant. In Union prisons like Camp Douglas in Illinois or Elmira in Newark, Confederate prisoners suffered horribly, with mortality rates sometimes exceeding those of battlefield combat. Conditions were so poor that even basic survival was a struggle within this already harsh environment. Punishments like tying prisoners to cattle served as an additional layer of torment. Eyewitness accounts suggest that such punishments were not merely about discipline, They were also a spectacle, a way for guards to assert dominance. In some cases, groups of prisoners were subjected to this humiliation at once, creating a scene where Confederate soldiers became unwilling participants in a public display of ridicule. Guards treated it as entertainment, laughing as the men squirmed and suffered. For prisoners, there was no escape, bound tightly, exposed to the gaze of others, and left to endure both the physical and emotional torture of the act. Psychologists today would describe this kind of punishment as a form of psychological warfare. By stripping men of their dignity, it broke down their spirit, leaving them more likely to comply, less likely to resist, and far less confident in their cause. The shame of such punishment didn't just last during captivity. It followed many men after their release. Veterans spoke less about the battles they fought and more about the humiliations they endured, because those left deeper scars than even bullets or bayonets. But why cattle? The choice was deliberate. Cattle were seen as dirty, base creatures, beasts of burden with no nobility. To tie a man to a horse, for example, might still retain some sense of symbolic warrior imagery. But to bind him to cattle was to equate him with filth, with something lowly and shameful. It wasn't just about restraint, it was about degradation at the most basic, animalistic level. The Civil War was already a conflict that blurred the lines of humanity. Brothers fought brothers, families were divided, and cruelty seemed to have no limits. In such a climate, punishments like this one reflected the growing sense that the enemy was not even human. Confederate prisoners, in the eyes of some Union guards, were traitors who had forfeited their right to dignity, and so they were treated accordingly, not as men, but as objects of ridicule, tools for amusement, or simply animals to be broken. The long hours tied to the rear of cattle left men broken in body and mind. The pain in their muscles, the ache in their bones, and the nausea from the stench were only part of the ordeal. The real punishment lay in the stripping away of humanity, in the laughter of their captors, in the haunting realization that they were powerless to stop their humiliation. This punishment may not have killed its victims outright, but in many ways, it destroyed them. Men who endured it often emerged with a permanent mark on their psyche, unable to shake the memories of shame. And in the larger scope of history, it stands as one of the most shocking examples of how war can drive men to invent cruelties not just to defeat their enemies, but to degrade them utterly. The punishment of Confederate prisoners tied to the backs of cattle stood out not only for its brutality but also for its deliberate psychological torment. Imagine the endless hours, strapped face first against the rough, foul-smelling hide of an animal, unable to move, unable to breathe fresh air properly, and forced to march wherever the beast wandered. Prisoners described the scraping of horns or the twitching of tails smearing dirt and filth across their faces. The humiliation was constant. It wasn't just pain, it was degradation. A punishment meant to remind these men that they were considered less than human. The soldiers who carried out these acts often laughed or jeered, treating the bound men as spectacles for amusement. Guards were known to prod the cattle to move faster, making the prisoners stumble and crash into uneven ground if the cattle ran. The men had no choice but to endure being dragged. Cuts, bruises, and broken bones piled on quickly. But the deeper damage was to their dignity. For men raised in a culture that valued honor above almost everything, this punishment shredded their pride more effectively than any whip, even after the ordeal ended. The shame lingered. Survivors recalled how their fellow prisoners looked away, too horrified to meet their eyes. The memory of being strapped to an animal became a stain that never washed away. Families who later heard whispers of what their loved ones endured often found it impossible to imagine. That was part of the cruelty punishment, so bizarre and humiliating that retelling them sounded almost unbelievable, yet they were very real. What makes this punishment especially shocking is how it reflects the darker side of warfare. The desire not only to defeat an enemy, but to erase his humanity. Tying men to cattle didn't shorten the war or change strategy, it was pure cruelty, a twisted exercise in power. By reducing men to the level of beasts, The punishers reminded them that captivity was not just about being held behind bars. It was about breaking the spirit over time. Accounts of such punishments spread quietly, often through diaries, letters, or hushed conversations among survivors. Official records rarely mentioned them, where leaders had little interest in documenting acts that could stain reputations, yet the truth survived in fragments, carried forward by voices that refused to let such cruelty vanish into silence. When we look back at the Civil War today, we often focus on battles, generals, and turning points. But hidden beneath those larger stories are human experiences that reveal the real cost of war. These punishments remind us that suffering wasn't always about bullets or bayonets. Sometimes it came from a guard's choice to invent new ways to torment the defeated. And so, the image of Confederate prisoners tied to cattle lingers as one of the most degrading punishments of the Civil War. It's a story not told in textbooks but whispered in the corners of history, waiting for us to confront the uncomfortable truth: war's end. But the scars, both physical and psychological, remain with those who lived through them. For the men who endured this punishment, the war never truly ended. Stories like these force us to question how far human cruelty can go. When unchecked, they remind us that history is not just about glory or victory, but also about the darkest corners of human behavior. These punishments demand to be remembered, not out of morbid fascination, but so we never forget what suffering war can unleash. If you found this story as shocking as I did, make sure to follow for more hidden and brutal truths from history. Behind every war and every empire lies a shadowed past, and here we uncover it. Don't forget to share this story, because the world deserves to know the realities that history tried to bury.